So it's eerily quiet. Can somebody say something just to make sure I have sound?
Hey, Jason.
All right, cool. Thank you.
Good morning, Jason.
Morning.
I saw that there's like 2 other committee meetings at this time, so busy morning.
We'll just give it another second for folks to log on. We'll give it one more minute, then we'll get started.
Peter, can you stop the share for the introduction, please? Thanks. Just glad to know it works.
All right, I think we'll get started in the interest of everybody's time. But thank you, everybody, for being here today. I'm excited. I hope everyone's excited to have a presentation on the great work that was done by OPM and Urbanomics on this question of Connecticut's housing policy and to what extent it plays a role in either creating segregation, perhaps perpetuating segregation. That was a question I asked a couple of years ago. More than anything, one, because I'm passionate about the topic, but two, I wanted to better understand exactly what role it is that policymakers have or play on this question of segregation, which I think the study makes clear that Connecticut is one of the most segregated states, or is incredibly segregated. Maybe not most, right? It's not about comparisons. It's about the fact that we are, and try to figure out to what extent do we care. I think there's a question out there about that. It's a difficult topic and policy area to develop solutions to. But I know over the years, there's been this question out there, at least among some people, almost a denial that perhaps it's a real issue in our state. And obviously it has implications for so many other policy areas. And that's why I'm particularly passionate about it. And I had asked for this study to be done. So I appreciate the work that's been, again, done by OPM and Urbanomics to put this report together and provide us as lawmakers and policymakers that additional context and information that we should have at our disposal to try to answer these difficult questions. So it looks like Tina is unmuted and maybe going to take the lead on introductions, or maybe it's Manisha. I'll turn it over to somebody.
So I'll kick it off briefly and then hand it over to Tina. So good morning, everyone. And thank you to the members of the Housing Roundtable for joining us today. My name is Manisha Srivastava. I'm an economist and policy coordinator here at OPM, and I was a state project lead for the Housing and Segregation Study. So Public Act 21-2 required OPM to aggregate data related to state and federal housing programs, and then use that data to analyze the impact of such programs on economic and racial segregation in the state. So after issuing an RFP, OPM contracted with a New York-based consulting firm for the study, Urbanomics, who is thankfully we're very grateful that they came today to present. And as you will see, Urbanomics has done a great job of unpacking the history, the policies of the past that have cast long shadows and can continue to impact segregation and the trends that we see till today. They also dedicated a lot of time to cleaning and linking housing data from multiple sources. And then they use this data as well as the census data to look at longer term trends. So you'll see that there's from 1990 to 2020, specifically 30 years as when available was documented in the report. So Urbanomics, they work closely not only with myself, but we worked with others at OPM. We worked with the Department of Housing, CHFA, the Connecticut Housing Finance Authority. They also interviewed directors from public housing authorities, developers, housing advocates to bring all voices to the table and to help inform this report. OPM has submitted actually the final housing and segregation study in its entirety as it was presented and prepared by Urbanomics. And we're ready to assist the General Assembly in evaluating the study recommendations in our joint efforts to increase affordable housing as well as workforce housing. So before I hand it over to Urbanomics, I also want to note that we have created at OPM a housing and segregation study website that has numerous additional tools. So for example, there's some data visualization tools. There is a housing data dashboard with a lot of different numerics and data. There's also a report appendix that Urbanomics put together that summarizes the over 80 federal and state housing programs in the state. It looks at information such as the history of these programs, the funding source, eligibility for these programs, and an estimated number of units by program. And then to simplify that, we also created a story map that summarizes all of these housing programs and then maps them for you to, that you can, and interactive maps to use. So I encourage everybody to explore the website in addition to the report. And with that, I will hand it over to Tina Lund, Principal of Urbanomics, to kick off the presentation.
Thank you so much, Manisha. And again, thank you so much for your leadership on this project as we were going through it. There were a lot of people involved, but Manisha was really deserves all credit as the driving force for keeping everyone on track, especially when the project started to grow arms that weren't initially expected. So with that, I'm going to have Peter first from my office. Please share his screen so we can go through the presentation. Okay. So again, welcome and thank you for joining us this morning. Next slide, please. What we're going to do is give a little introduction to Urbanomics, an overview of the purpose of the study from the scope of work perspective. We'll go through the project activities and products that ended up being developed. And then Peter will take us through the segregation indices and spatial analysis that were the key drivers of the report. And then it'll go back to me to talk about some descriptive statistics that get at the other underlying issues involved with segregation and housing development. I'll take a brief walk through the outreach we did and what we heard. And then we'll conclude with the key findings of the study and then our recommendations, which you've already begun acting on. So with that, next slide, please. So Urbanomics has been around since 1984. We're a WBE based in New York City. We look at almost all of the economic aspects of planning, forecasting and modeling, economic development, market and fiscal analysis, impact assessments, and a large part of this is housing. And as the firm has progressed, we've come to a kind of triple bottom line look of things where we look at not just the economics of it all, which is, a key driver, but also we try to look at the social and environmental aspects of planning it all because it all works together. And so I'm Tina Lund. I've been with the firm since 1997. I've been principal of the firm since 2018, principal and majority owner. And I'm joined with Peter First, who is a senior planner, and he has been with the firm for more than 10 years. Go on. Next, please. So the purpose of this study, addressing both segregation and affordability in housing stock. The sharp rise in home prices and market rents over the last several years have exacerbated neighborhood divides, reduced access to adequate housing, and have further contributed to workforce shortages, something that's becoming a huge issue, not just in Connecticut, but regionally. There's increased pressure on government to generate more affordable housing because the market isn't doing it on its own. There's also increased awareness of racial disparities in housing options. So the study purpose was to evaluate the extent of segregation throughout Connecticut and its municipalities, aggregate the state's housing program data because there are many sources and many ways that's collected, and understand the role that HUD and Connecticut housing programs play in alleviating or perpetuating these conditions. Next slide, please. So what we did is we did a summary of all of the existing state and federal housing assistance programs that impact housing markets. Manisha already talked about the detailed summaries that are provided in the appendix. We looked at descriptive statistics of socioeconomic and housing trends and their impacts on segregation. We did an analysis of indices of segregation and income equality over a 30-year period, so 1990 through 2020 in 5-year increments, to the extent that data were available. We did a spatial analysis of subsidized housing program impacts on segregation, also over that 30-year period. We also did outreach to officials, industry leaders, housing advocates. We also made an effort to hold focus groups with residents of subsidized housing. And then we also produced the final report, the key findings and recommendations relative to policy impacts on segregation. Go ahead. And then the products that came out of it. Manisha's already talked about how they are available on OPM's housing website. But I think these are some very interesting tools and provide the user with ways to do comparative looks at the data we pull together. Because it's a lot of words and it's a lot of numbers, and it's a much easier way to get through it all and drill down to the areas that interest each user in particular. Next slide, please. And with that, I will turn it over to Peter to give a brief description of the 9 indices studied.
Thank you, Tina. So we calculated 9 different indices for race and ethnicity segregation for various geographies, including statewide, planning region, labor markets, municipalities, and urban, suburban, and rural areas. There isn't exactly a one-size-fits-all index, and so having these different indices are useful at different geography levels and for evaluating segregation from different perspectives. So these were calculated for the period from 1990 to 2020 at 10-year intervals, looking at the segregation of Black non-Hispanics to white non-Hispanics, Hispanics to white non-Hispanics, and Asian and Pacific Islanders to white non-Hispanics. The multi-dissimilarity index is the most commonly used, and this is most useful for looking at large cities, labor markets, and regions. And it looks at the evenness of population distributions across the study area, such as how many residents would need to move from one area to another to create an even distribution. The other indices look at centralization, concentration, clustering, and exposure of one race or ethnicity group to another. We also studied the Gini Index of Income Inequality, which is the most common measurement of income inequality, and that looks at the distribution of wealth across different areas. Next, this is a slide of the dissimilarity index for the state's planning regions for Black non-Hispanics to white non-Hispanics. So a higher value indicates higher levels of segregation or uneven distribution between these two population groups. What we noticed was segregation steadily declining in the planning regions with the highest segregation levels, and these were also home to the state's largest cities. So these are areas such as Capital Region, Greater Bridgeport, and South Central Connecticut. From this perspective, no planning regions experienced a rise in segregation from 1990 to 2020, but some saw lesser declines than others. Next, this slide looks at Hispanic to white non-Hispanic dissimilarity index. And here segregation levels were generally lower than the Black non-Hispanic to white non-Hispanic segregation levels. And they steadily declined in the planning regions again with the highest segregation levels, which were also home to the state's largest cities. Except one area, the Northwest Hills, is a more rural region than the others. And this area saw a rather sharp rise in segregation from 1990 to 2010, and this declined somewhat over the past decade. Here's a map of government subsidized housing that we prepared using a range of government data sources from HUD, CHSA, Department of Housing, Connecticut Department of Housing, and then other sources. And so we prepared these detailed project data files that Tina described earlier, and we mapped them by race, ethnicity, and target populations for government subsidized housing across the state. So these projects were cross-referenced with multiple sources to ensure accuracy. And the target populations don't fully show all of the government subsidized housing across the state. It's sort of specific to some sources. And we also looked at housing program participation across all these housing units, as well as the race and ethnicity of heads of households within those housing units. Project units were aggregated by town for use in the spatial analysis, which I'll describe next, and for data users in the form of an Excel-based data tool. And this data is also available on the housing data portal as well, which Manisha described earlier. Next, we did a spatial analysis, and this was conducted to better understand the impacts of subsidized housing on the state's segregation levels. More specifically, could the share of subsidized housing units out of the total housing stock reliably predict segregation better than socioeconomic variables? So this was a multiple regression analysis. First, we did an exploratory regression exercise, which evaluated the predictive power of 9 different groups of subsidized housing units, different program types, more specifically. And we compared these versus 27 different socioeconomic variables over the period from 1990 to 2020. So this exercise was run separately for the Black non-Hispanic and Hispanic indices, the dissimilarity index, using single variable with multi-variable models. And it was run at the statewide level using each municipality as a sample, and then separately for city and suburban regions. What we found was that the results of the analysis found a weak predictive relationship in single variable models for the subsidized housing variables, ability to predict the segregation indices over time. There are many complex factors that contributed to segregation, and subsidized housing represents a small portion of the state's housing stock. So you have a lot of naturally occurring affordable housing in some areas, which also plays a part. So the more complex multivariable models included both subsidized housing and other socioeconomic variables such as population density, tenure, poverty rates, and labor force participation. These proved to have higher predictive power than the share of subsidized housing in a given community. The direct statewide relationship of the subsidized housing variables on segregation levels was considered to be weak, while their indirect relationship was considered to be moderate. In short, while there is a correlation between subsidized housing and segregation, there was no proven causal relationship. Next, I'll hand it back to Tina.
Okay. So that was really our primary focus, was to find out if that causal relationship existed. But when we didn't end up with a causal relationship, we looked at the underlying socioeconomic factors that went along with things to see if there were implications there from a policy perspective. So the key thing we found is one of the greatest impacts is the historical cause of segregation in the state, redlining. So this map shows the percentage of the population that is white non-Hispanic. So the darker the purple, the whiter the area. And that's overlaid with the red line districts of the 30s, 40s, and 50s. And as you can see, those red line districts are primarily the urban areas. Next slide, please. This is going to be the most long-winded of slides, so don't worry, there's only one like this. So a lot of what's happening in terms of the reduction of segregation can be really attributed to the change in settlement patterns for different racial and ethnic groups in this state. So the first map, map 1, the large one, is the total non-white population, which increased by 20.6 percentage points in the 30 years between 1990 and 2020. But as indicated by the darker colors for those municipalities, that is where the change is greatest. So essentially along the I-95-87 corridors and along the coast for the most part. Map 2 on the lower left is the same map, but strictly dealing with the African American non-Hispanic population. That group only saw a 2.1% percentage point increase overall over 30 years, with the greatest increases in shares along those same corridors. But the other thing to note is the light areas throughout the state, which actually saw decreases in the share of the African American population. So there was a moving away of African Americans from some of those rural areas. Map number 3 is the net change in the Hispanic and Latino population. That was an increase of 10.8 percentage points throughout the state over 30 years. There have been notable increases not only along the corridor, but particularly in Western Connecticut, but there were growth throughout the state. And then finally, map 4 is the net change in the Asian Pacific Islander population. This is an increase of 3.3% statewide, and the change largely follows those same settlement patterns as the other groups, primarily along that corridor. Next slide, please. So subsidized units are almost always, not always, but almost always in multifamily housing, although not all multifamily housing is subsidized units. This map shows the share of multifamily structures with 10 or more units out of all housing in 1990. As you can see, the greatest concentrations are in the urban centers, mostly the redlined areas. Next slide, please. It's the same map, but for 2020. There's a noticeable increase throughout the state in the number of these larger buildings with multiple units, but still largely in the urban and coastal areas and along the corridor. Next slide. Next slide takes a step back and goes down to all multifamily housing. So any structure with 2 or more units. So this includes duplexes, townhouses, very small apartment buildings, as well as all of those larger buildings. So this is the share of total housing in 1990, and obviously this is much more widespread. Next slide, please. Same map is for 2020, and it shows that in many rural areas, multifamily housing of all types decreased in share. So Peter, if you could flip back to 1990 and then to 2020. If you look at those areas of the Northwest Hills and Southeastern Connecticut, you can see that single family homes started to really increase in overall share while multifamily went down. So next slide, please. So as you well know, Connecticut and the region as a whole is suffering from a housing shortage. This demand, with a lack of new supply, leads to higher housing costs and contributes to economic and racial segregation. So there's greater competition for new housing. This map shows the number of net new housing permits of all types. So this is total new permits minus demolitions over the decade of the 1990s, so 1990 to 1999, distributed throughout the state. The next slide is those same permits for the 2000s. And you can see a lot in the same core areas, but fewer in the rural areas. And now slide 21. These were the net new housing permits allotted in the decade between 2010 and 2019. Many fewer. So the number of new units allowed has been slowing down over the last 3 decades. Next slide, please. So then there are some underlying reasons for this. Historically, multifamily housing needed to be located in areas with sewer systems, as shown in this map of subsidized housing sites overlaid on municipal sewer systems as of 2020. Now, this is a requirement in the Connecticut Plan of Conservation and Development, which made total sense. However, now new septic technology can support smaller multifamily buildings. So it doesn't necessarily need to be a limitation for multifamily to be on a sewer system. Next slide, please. Another logical requirement from the state POCD is for subsidized housing to be located in areas with access to transit. And this also limits where subsidized housing can be developed. And you can see that existing sites are along those transit lines for the most part. Next slide. So now that we've looked at those underlying infrastructure conditions, let's take a look at the share of subsidized housing units out of all units throughout the state. Now, while the highest concentrations are in the urban areas, as we expected, there's also a noticeable share in Eastern Connecticut. And those housing units, those subsidized housing units, aren't necessarily multifamily homes. They're largely single-family homeowner subsidies. So that really increases the distribution. Those single unit subsidies really help to distribute the distribution of subsidized housing throughout the state. I need to throw in a side note. These subsidies are programmatic subsidies. This does not include homeowner mortgage tax abatements. Because if we had that, the entire state would be dark orange and everything would look like it was all good. This is just programmatic, what we think of as housing subsidies, as opposed to the largest one in the country, really. Next slide, please. Now, getting more directly to the issue of segregation and subsidized housing, this map shows the white non-Hispanic share of total population by census block group, overlaid with the same metric for the heads of households in subsidized housing. So anywhere the yellow dots pop out, as you can see in the Naugatuck Valley and Northwest Hills, in those areas, there's a disproportionate share of people of color in subsidized housing. However, in most instances, the dots are the same color as the surrounding area. So the population in subsidized housing is reflecting the population at large in the area. If you're looking at strictly white non-Hispanics versus people of color in general. Next slide, please. This slide is the same comparison, but for Black non-Hispanic residents as a whole. Here, there are very few sites that pop out as having a mismatch in terms of population. If there is a low overall share of Black non-Hispanics in the total population, there's generally a low overall share of Black non-Hispanics Black non-Hispanic heads of households in subsidized housing. And then next, please. This is the same kind of visual test for Hispanic residents. And this is interesting because there is more often a lesser share of Hispanic households in subsidized housing than in the general population in urban areas. So fewer Hispanic households in subsidized housing in urban areas where the share of the Hispanic population is greater. And it's just the reverse in rural, suburban and rural areas where they're more likely to be Hispanic or Latino residents in subsidized housing than there is in the population at large. So next slide, please. Kind of gives an overview of the outreach. We spoke with affordable housing developers, public housing administrators, advocates, other professionals, and that included planners from various COGs, as well as a couple of community and economic development directors from around the state. We attempted many, many times to put together focus groups of public housing residents and voucher holders without success. And we have some ideas as to how to increase their involvement in future efforts that weren't in the report, but I would be happy to share those if you all are interested. However, we didn't do focus groups, we did speak to several individuals who are former residents of public housing to get some insight on the transition out of public housing and the things that are important in terms of making a move to a higher opportunity area. Next. So the takeaways that we got after speaking to all of those people is there needs to be an increase in affordable housing stock, particularly in communities of opportunity. There are impediments, local opposition to development, policy is not enforced, funding has not kept up with market construction and real estate costs. And there are strategies to combat this, mandating fair share policy, increasing funding, revisit qualified allocation plan criteria to allow for greater geographic distribution of financing. I mean, there are lots of things that can be done, and only you can select which will work. The other thing is to support mobility. There are impediments, there are wait lists, individual applications for each area, participant willingness to relocate, because behavior is always a factor. And psychology is always a factor. There's the issue of landlord willingness to accept vouchers and the gap between voucher values and actual rents. And strategies, of course, are mobility counseling, gap funding for security deposits and vacancy cap, some of which the state is already doing, but there are still some holes in that process. Next. So overall, our key findings. Connecticut's metropolitan areas remain among the most segregated in the nation. The most common indices of segregation, however, have decreased in general. As of 2020, in 65% of Connecticut communities, a greater share of subsidized housing heads of household were people of color than in the municipality as a whole. Sometimes not by a lot, but in general, they were higher. Development-based subsidized housing projects clustering communities that have already demonstrated a willingness to accept subsidized housing. That only makes sense. It's an easier lift. The gap between subsidized and market rate housing costs continue to increase. Income disparity is increasing. Studies show that changes to public housing programs through affirmative housing have done little to decrease segregation. Development projects are dependent on local approvals, and acceptance of projects take place only where subsidized developments already exist. As a general rule, it's very difficult, and this came a lot from developers. It's very, very difficult to develop new housing anywhere without a proven track record of it. Housing choice vouchers and single family mortgages have greater potential to alleviate segregation because they can be used more widely, and efforts to eliminate how governments perpetuate segregation by race, income, and other identities need to take a multi-dimensional approach. There's no one silver bullet to fix segregation. There are lots of key pieces that need to be chipped away at. And with that, we'll move on to our recommendations. So one is increase access to existing subsidized housing. We suggest creating a statewide application portal to be a single access point to active federal, state, and local housing choice vouchers, so site-based housing, and public housing opportunities statewide. However, before jumping into this, there needs to be a feasibility study to determine startup and maintenance costs, because if it isn't done well and maintained, it could be detrimental. Secondly, the portal should tie into community information to inform mobility decisions. And we detail that extensively and how that should work in the report. And the second thing is to maintain a fund for security deposit coverage for housing choice vouchers. A lot of times landlords are requesting, more than a month of security deposit for voucher holders, whether or not that's allowable. But there's that perception that voucher holders are more likely to do damage to the home. Okay, so secondly, develop additional quality housing throughout the state. The easiest way to get things built is to establish and adopt an actionable affirmative housing policy. And that should target an array of income levels, should include both incentives for compliance and penalties for non-compliance, and incentivize redevelopment for existing projects or of existing projects that have are in poor repair. The other good thing to do would be to streamline the approvals process to reduce development costs, eliminate select discretionary review processes, for example, for design or architecture, the back and forth among which can add years and hundreds of thousands of dollars to development costs. And there are places that have successfully done this in the recent past. Next slide, please. Our third set of recommendations for housing choice vouchers, advocate for fair market rents or voucher values that are more reflective of real market conditions. Currently, voucher values come from the HUD's fair market rents, which are based on data that generally lags several years behind current market conditions. So there's usually a gap between what a landlord can get just posting the unit for rent versus accepting a voucher. Align Connecticut and federal program voucher values to eliminate uncertainty for both landlords and tenants. Create vacancy gap funding to cover the month required for HUD inspection and approval. That's one of the landlord's complaints about accepting vouchers, is for a unit to be approved. There's a month that ends up with a vacant unit during the inspection process. So covering that month would certainly help get people into units more quickly. Public housing improvements, consider a RAD type redevelopment program for aging state properties. Reduce program administration costs, make household evaluations biennial instead of annual, and that's in your new legislation. Allow age restricted only housing to avoid elderly disabled conflict. I know this is contrary to other regulations, but it was the #1 concern among housing authority administrators. They spend a huge amount of time dealing with conflicts between senior residents and younger residents. The other thing would be to provide on-site mental health and other supportive services, perhaps not only for residents, but for people who are employees of the housing authority. And then finally, allow flexibility in redevelopment renovations to meet changing needs of residents. And again, I know some of these can only be applied to state properties. HUD properties aren't impacted by these, but it could make a difference for these state sites. Next slide, please. Promote mobility to deconcentrate poverty, continue to support and expand mobility counseling services, fund and implement the single access portal to enable mobility. It's really daunting to have to apply for each housing authority throughout the state in hopes that maybe you'll find a home somewhere. Also provide post-move supportive services to assist in integration. It can be a big cultural change moving from a low to a high opportunity area, and it's been found that having someone to help smooth through that process makes a huge difference in terms of people staying in their new neighborhoods. Modify legislation to promote housing development and desegregation. I know the state plan of conservation and development is in process right now, and there's a draft plan and they're working on it. Potential additions that we'd like to recommend are to incorporate affordable housing and desegregation language into the relevant sections, incentivize transit-oriented and mixed-use development, require and incentivize mixed income housing as part of mixed use and transit-oriented developments. And I'm not saying all affordable, but mixed income. Mixed income seems to be the best way to ensure increasing financial viability throughout a community. Require compliance with the affirmative affordable housing plans. Modify environmental policy restrictions to allow multifamily housing using new septic technologies in non-sewer areas. Next slide, please. And then finally, modify legislation to promote housing development and desegregation, revise the low-income housing tax credit QAP criteria to allow for greater geographic diversity. And those 2 points are in legislation right now. And also use CGS Section 15, Section 8-68D to collect data on race ethnicity for all subsidized units. That was one of our hurdles in doing the segregation analysis, is while HUD collects data on the race and ethnicity of residents, the state does not necessarily do so. So it's hard to assess the full extent of an issue if you don't have the full data set. Of course, safeguards need to be put into place to how that information is used. And with that, I'd like to conclude by saying thank you very much and open the floor to questions.
No, thank you very much for that presentation. It answered a lot of questions, and it obviously resulted in a lot more questions that I think can be asked about how to proceed on this issue. I think, just one of the big ones, right, was this whole causal correlative kind of analysis. So obviously, I mean, maybe explain that a little bit to us. I know for those of us who are the wonks, we probably understand exactly how you're answering that question. But it seems so much of the other information seems to indicate that there are perhaps some policies that did lead to where we are, perhaps historical, maybe not current. I believe they're probably current too. But maybe expand upon that a little bit. Like you weren't able to find a causal relationship, but a correlative one. But you also identified all sorts of things that we are doing that perhaps contribute to segregation.
Right. So what it all boils down to is there are so many underlying factors which have influenced where affordable or subsidized housing has been located, that there's a definite correlation between that and segregation. But because there are so many underlying factors, you can't say that subsidized housing is what's creating segregation. Subsidized housing where it is now is more responding to those other factors. So it's almost more of a result. However, there are policies that still exist that, maintain that situation.
Yeah, right. One of the concerns I've had, given primarily the location of where subsidized housing is, in particular public housing authorities and where they are, and how that overlays with the racial demographics of that particular community. As we continue to reinvest, and we should, right, rebuild that housing to provide the individuals who live there with higher quality housing. I've always been concerned that does have the effect of perpetuating segregation. Am I inaccurate in that, or is that a fair assessment? And same thing with LIHTC credits, right? Where they're used primarily.
Mhm.
Does that also have the effect of perhaps perpetuating what we already know to be true based on historical actions?
Tina, you also, sorry, I think part of your response could be that there's that map in the report. We didn't include it in the slides today that showed public housing authorities throughout the state and the change in share of people of color.
Yes. Yeah, that definitely would help on things. Um, I don't want to come out and say that there shouldn't be reinvestment in original things. I mean, that's the what I fear the talking point would be, to confirm that. But yes, I think there are ways to reduce that perpetuation by making redevelopment in existing facilities mixed income. You don't want to necessarily replace an all affordable building at a particular income level with the exact same. It would be great to expand that building so it would also include higher levels of income. So it's more of a mixed income community and with a higher quality of housing for everyone. I think that's how the way to move forward. So it provides investment where it's really needed, especially in the replacement of buildings that have reached the end of their utility and life cycle. But it's replacing it with something that allows for more income mobility or establishes a potential for more income mobility.
And I know there's some others who want to ask questions, so I will not go on forever. I have a lot of questions to ask, only because I'm really interested in this, and that's why. But you know, one of the points. What was the point that you were making about? I think it was the first slide around the redlining. What was the ultimate point you were seeking to make there?
The ultimate point was redlining was absolutely the key, the basis for segregation. It's the only place that people of color, particularly African Americans, could purchase housing.
And I just want to make one
Yeah.
editorial. You know, you made a reference to fair share. I tend to be a lightning rod for that particular thing, and I just want to clarify for the world that I was not interviewed for this study or anything. So that answer didn't come from me; it came from somewhere.
No,
but
no, that came from best practices in terms of places that have had success in creating affordable housing throughout the state. And
Yeah.
we did not interview you for that very purpose.
I appreciate that. I just wanted to make sure we maintain your objectivity and
Yeah.
OPM's as well too in this whole thing. On the housing choice voucher, often seen as a kind of a solution that could help address segregation. And I know there's been criticisms, you know, out there that most of those subsidies, whether it's housing choice or RAP certificates, tend to only go to Hartford and New Haven and Bridgeport. Do you have a sense of why that's the case and why they aren't used in other parts of the state that aren't Hartford, New Haven, or Bridgeport?
Hartford, New Haven, and Bridgeport are more used to accepting them. They have landlords that are more familiar with the program and are more established, and it's harder to bring to get vouchers accepted in new markets is what it boils down to. It's very often landlord choice. And there are impediments in accepting vouchers. I mean, you are guaranteed your rent every month, but there are concerns on the part of landlords about voucher holders trashing the property, which has not been shown to be true. There are also those gaps in for inspections, and that's particularly for HUD vouchers where you lose a month of rent, and the housing market is so hot. Why would a landlord choose to be off market for rent when they could have somebody in the apartment the next day? So there are definite impediments there.
Is there an additional impediment in terms of the actual supply, right? So you can have a housing choice voucher, but if there's no unit in a particular community, you're obviously not going to move there, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
All right, well, I'll stop now. I have more, but I want to allow other folks on the committee. I know Francis had his hand up and then David.
Right. Thank you for a presentation of this very thought-provoking study. A couple of things, I guess, riffing on Representative Rojas's comment about fair share and not being interviewed. I did look at the list of interviewees, and I do not see any municipal chief elected officials. I do not see any town planners. I do not see any planning and zoning commissioners. I do not see any environmental scientists, sanitarians, or wastewater engineers. So I'm curious how the list of people you consulted was created.
Initially the list was supposed to be, Manisha, help me out here. Trying to think of what was in the original RFP.
Well, the interview as a whole, we expanded the scope a little bit beyond what was in the legislation to
Yes.
just studying, the impact of housing programs on segregation. So, but I think we focused it on the development of housing and the supply of housing.
Yes, I believe so. And then
We did contact all
Yeah.
the town planners and all the largest municipalities in the state and asked them if they would like to interview, but they just chose not to participate.
And then finally, I just also add in limited resources, right? There is a set contract value,
Right.
contract in place. And as Tina already mentioned, there's an attempt to create focus groups. A lot of work went into that, unfortunately unsuccessfully. So it just also resources was part of it.
Yeah. The other part of it too is we're a planning consulting firm, and we work with both municipalities and developers throughout the area, and spend a lot of time working with P&Zs and municipalities. So we kind of felt that wasn't a gap in our knowledge, but no, we did not specifically speak to them.
So I think that the analysis you did is really interesting, but I'm a little concerned that some perspectives may be missing from the recommendations, perspectives that bear on the feasibility, implementability, or the opportunity cost of some of the recommendations. So I just want to touch on those briefly. One is the discussion about conditioning development on public water and public sewer. There are environmental reasons for that. There are also cost reasons. We have seen other states use so-called alternative treatment systems, which are essentially mini packaged sewage treatment plants. Connecticut has experience with those with single tenant properties, so commercial or industrial properties or institutional residences. They have a really bad track record in other states. Homeowner associations generally are not able to maintain them. They have high maintenance, ongoing maintenance costs. And when wastewater or subsurface sewage disposal systems fail in Connecticut, it falls to the municipality to remedy those. So I think it's a bit premature to call for those. The state is looking at it, but there are a lot of valid concerns. And frankly, setting aside those concerns, generally it will be a lot less costly for a developer to attach to existing municipal infrastructure than have to rebuild all the infrastructure on site, right? A connection to a water and sewer main is cheaper than creating your own community water system and your own alternative treatment system plant. So if we're talking about affordable housing in this context, I do think we have to keep those things in mind. My second comment on this is regarding fair share and how it may interplay or not interplay with the discussions about other recommendations and discussion about redlining. So several years ago, when fair share was first proposed in Connecticut, at Westcog, we objected to it because it would have the impact of redlining the cities in Connecticut, bringing back redlining. It would deny funding for housing construction or rehabilitation to the state central cities. And we were very concerned about bringing back a policy that we now widely regard as racist. And the most recent iteration of fair share, again, has allocations of 0 for central cities in Connecticut. So I don't know how you can square a recommendation for fair share housing allocations with a critique of past redlining practices. I see too much similarity between them. Secondly, I see great recommendations to incorporate or focus on transit-oriented development in the state plan of conservation and development. But the fair share allocations, as they're currently proposed for study in statute, do not consider transportation. In fact, they don't even consider local housing need. They're solely based upon proxies that may have nothing to do with housing need. And the bill that is referred to in here that would change the qualified allocation plan for the low-income housing tax credits would move away from a system where we can consider water and sewer connections, bus and rail service, proximity to shopping and services, brownfield redevelopment, and local poverty. So we consider a broad range of planning factors that could really be critical for the success of a housing project and the social and economic success of its residents, and replace it with the fair share system that scatters housing across the state without considering all the other things that are determinants of household success. So again, I see a conflict there between recommending using the fair share housing allocations to redistribute the low-income housing tax credits, and then in the state plan of conservation development, pushing for transit-oriented development.
Okay. That's a lot to unpack, but I see your concerns. I don't necessarily see them as being as being one or the other. The changing of the prioritization, it's one in many categories in terms of the QAP. So it wasn't a matter of recommending that everything would be replaced with those locational factors. It was meant to be in the tiebreaker issue, just so that it's possible for other areas to get funding that need them. And also, I believe the other criteria was particularly areas that have high demand that's been unmet under FSHA categories. As far as septic sewer is concerned, I think we said allow. I mean, there are always going to be environmental reviews for any site planning, and that would include anything involving wastewater and sewer. So there may be some places where it will work. There may be and there will likely be places where it won't work, but that would be taken up in that P&Z review process. Let's see. Fair share versus redlining. Nothing about fair share, in my perspective, prohibits the creation of subsidized housing in areas that already have high levels of affordable housing. It's just a way to make sure that affordable housing is available throughout the state. But again, that's up to your process and your political process. This is strictly based on our recommendations.
So, and I appreciate you listening to my long comment. Sorry. Lots of things to rattle around this head of mine. So I guess one point of clarification I may just follow up very briefly is when you say fair share housing allocations, is that a reference to the concept of fair share or to the specific language that is currently in state law and that has been floated by advocates?
It is the concept of fair share.
Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you, Francis. David, followed by Nandini.
You're still on mute.
Thank you, Representative Rojas, and thank you, Tina, and your team for the presentation. I thought it had a lot of very valuable information. I run an affordable housing development company here in Connecticut, and what we see generally is just to pick up on two of your comments in the report. Number one, why aren't vouchers used outside of the large cities? A lot of that has to do with the way that vouchers are, the voucher rents are set. They are set on the fair market rent by and large, which is the 40 percentile rent. So if you imagine in an area, the rents range from the lowest percentile being the least rent to the 100th percentile, which is like the very highest rent in that area. Generally housing authorities can't pay more than the 40th percentile. And if that's set on the range in a metropolitan area, that generally means that rents in higher income communities are going to be too expensive for a voucher holder to use. And that's a national issue that there's not a whole lot the state can do about. The second comment that I wish to make is just about, why is subsidized housing not happening in wealthier communities? We get a lot of interest, genuine interest from higher income communities in developing affordable housing. We've successfully built housing in a higher income community. We get inquiries all the time from other higher income communities. In fact, this week I've been asked to present at two of these such communities about how affordable housing works. I think one of the impediments is that in these towns, the project size is relatively small for the reasons you outlined. The 20 to 30 units is generally what can work in these types of communities because of septic issues, because of floodplain issues, because of availability of land, cost of land. And 20 to 30 unit projects just do not align well with the development model. The tax credit program, which funds the vast majority of housing in the country, has such high transaction costs that it really doesn't work well at 20 to 30 units. Further, development companies like myself, we're expected to provide unlimited guarantees to projects with a cap on our profits. So the incentive is for us to seek out larger, less risky projects. And, doing a 20 unit project that's going to be hard to finance in a higher income community where we're not going to make money and we're probably going to lose money, there's just not a lot of incentive for us to do it. And so those projects, unfortunately, tend to get skipped by a lot of developers, and they never get developed. So I would look at, potentially trying to target funding in a way that makes development more palatable to developers, because I think the communities do have the interest in seeing this housing created, but it just has to be right for their community.
Yeah, feasibility was a huge issue when we spoke to developers, yes.
David, real quick on the second point you just made, is that largely an issue of federal policy and regulations, or is there a state component to that too?
Some of it is just federal, like the low-income housing tax credit program is just a very complex program. And so when you add in all of the transaction costs that are largely the same, whether you're doing 20 units or 200 units, you end up with a very high cost per unit for building a small project that becomes hard to justify. But the sort of economic and the economics of the development business is really a convention issue. It's just how the projects have historically been done, but developers have experienced a building environment in the last 2 to 3 years that is extraordinarily different from what it was in the past. And so, we've had to respond by really targeting projects that we know are going to be profitable. And that extends to nonprofits and for-profits, because nonprofits can't write unlimited checks to projects either.
No, thank you. And indeed, before we come to you, one of the questions I had was looking at page 4 and 5, which listed all of the programs, right? And I know some of them are out of our control because they're HUD, to the extent that we can advocate with our federal delegation to do something. But do we just have too many damn programs? Because it seems like a lot listed on the paper, and to what extent that does add to the burden on you to administer those programs. I imagine there's some flexibility that's allowed in having a diversity of programs. But the other side has to be true too, that it just adds to the complexity that maybe David is referencing right now too. And I don't know, maybe you can speak to, like, do we really need the CHFA need all of these programs, or can they be combined in some kind of strategic and effective way? And the same would be for DOH. So we'll turn it over to you to answer that softball.
Um,
Oh, okay. I thought you meant me, but go ahead.
I was just going to say, a lot of those programs are very targeted to very specific to target populations. And sorry to throw this on you guys, but I think most of it is determined by legislation.
We're at fault for everything, just for the record.
Yeah, well, there's a new pot of money, and it's, needs to be focused on a specific group or area. So thus a new sub program is born. I'm kind of speaking for Mike and for Chafa. I'm a representative that we worked with a lot at Chafa, but I'm pretty sure they would like to have fewer programs to try to administer at one time. I don't think it's a big leap by saying that. You can't quote me as them saying it, but I'm pretty sure that they would be good with fewer programs. Yes. So anyway, I'm sorry. So Nandini, your take on all of that?
We'd be open to those recommendations for sure. And I wonder to what extent does policymakers having all of these specialized programs not allow for actually mixed use development in a more, I don't know, feasible or possible way?
There seem to be a lot of rules, and very specific rules that really limit what can be done.
All right, Nandini, now I'll stop.
Okay. I'll start by just talking a little bit about the qualified allocation plan, because that seems to be coming up a bunch.
You just went to mute.
Yeah.
I don't know how that happened, but thank you for including my organization on this round. It's going to mute for some reason. I'm not sure.
Not me, just for the record.
Okay, you're not trying to put me on mute. Okay. Well, thank you for your time. I appreciate it. Around the question about programming, we would absolutely advocate for the ability to run as many programs as are optimal to meet the need, right, for affordable housing. So, there are certain programs that come to us through legislation that we often, will say that maybe we don't need a program for this or that. And so it would be ideal for an organization like CHFA, which is very sophisticated and has done this for a number of years, to figure out how to meet the need, given, the funding and, given our resources. So I'll just say that. In terms of the qualified allocation plan, it is a federal program. It is, it is run primarily through the U.S. Treasury Department. So it's not HUD, as the report actually has specified. What I would agree with the prior commentators that talked a little bit about some of the issues around developing affordable housing throughout the state. What I would like to add really is that because it's a federal program, it comes with a set of requirements around public input. And it requires, a significant amount of public sort of getting that comment, getting that input is an important part of the process of developing the qualified allocation plan, which by legislating would, could have the impact of weakening that process. So that will be one comment I have on the report and its recommendation. In terms of the actual recommendation to use to implement fair share in the qualified allocation plan, what we've found is that currently in our location prioritization uses the Connecticut Opportunity Map, which essentially creates incentives for development in communities where there's access to education, employment, low poverty, et cetera. And as Francis was saying, and others have said before, it's very, very challenging to get development done in areas of higher opportunity. So I just say that because, points are one thing, but they don't always achieve the policy goals the state may have. It also takes years for development to make it from concept all the way to, where they're actually submitting an application for low-income housing tax credit. So many issues along the way. Certainly transit-oriented is an important part of determining where best to build that kind of housing, to build subsidized housing, to increase the availability of housing statewide, keeping an eye on the fact that preservation is an equally important goal that the state should be focused on. So, I think primarily I just wanted to make a comment about the fact that it's a complicated document. It encapsulates a lot of the state's policy goals with respect to housing, and that legislating it may in fact weaken the ability of the state to look at all different aspects of its impact on various constituencies and make the most appropriate decision as to the best path forward. So thank you for the opportunity to speak, and I'll be happy to answer any questions.
No, thank you, Nandina.
Well,
We
thank you.
appreciate, Chafa's and your expertise in all these questions. I think Tina may have had a comment. Sorry, Tina.
Oh, no, I was just saying thank you for your input. That nothing was meant to, certainly none of the recommendations were meant to weaken the ability of the state to provide affordable housing. And we do recognize that the QAP deals with HUD programs, but since it is developed more locally, that's why we made recommendations regarding it. But yeah, the complexity of developing new affordable housing, it cannot be understated. And we are very understanding of that.
I'm just going back to one more question, and if folks have other questions, please raise your hand. Obviously you had some charts there about the kind of the 30-year view of single-family home development, rise in single-family home, decline in multifamily home. I imagine there's still a preference out there for both, but obviously we have a clear demarcation between the two. Do we have a sense of why? Is it just market demand, or are there regulatory barriers in place that allow one more easier to happen than the other?
It is generally easier throughout Connecticut because of zoning regulations to develop single family homes. And there are certainly, it's possible to do subsidized single family homes. And there's nothing wrong with single family at all.
I like mine, yes.
I can't understand it. I've lived in an apartment for so long. But everybody has their own preferences, and there should be a variety of housing available at income levels. And I think that was the goal, is to make sure there can be, to meet the need in as many ways as possible. It's just a bigger bang focus to look at multifamily.
And to the extent that or given the focus on transportation corridors and where things are located, makes sense. TOD, terms of sewer and water infrastructure, we know where that exists too. Are there likely communities along both of those nodes that perhaps have zoning regulations that only allow for single family versus multifamily? Or is it a mixed bag?
There is a mixed bag, but yeah, there are certainly communities that predominantly have single family home zoning. And that has an impact.
Which of course would be inconsistent with the POCD and
right.
even espoused goals and values that a community might have.
Right, but the communities make up their own, create their own zoning. So I think all the state can do is to make recommendations.
Oh, yeah, to that question, because you made a reference to home rule in here.
Yes.
Which is, we could spend 2 weeks probably on that. But, the ACIR, which is the Advisory Committee on Intergovernmental Relations, seem to suggest that home rule is more of a myth than an act. I mean, how much weight were you putting on home rule actually being real, as opposed to the more conceptual, theoretical understanding of home rule, right? I mean, in the ACIR report, it's clear that, you know, I don't want to mean this in a demeaning way, right? Towns are creatures of the state, or they're really only allowed to do things that the state empowers them to do. How does that jive with your statement in here that you made about home rule? I mean, I know I have it highlighted, so I can go find it, but.
In the outreach we did, with developers in particular and advocates, getting through the P&Z review process was one of the most difficult things. Finding sites because of zoning was very difficult. In my personal practice, zoning makes a lot of decisions. So there are, you know, only certain soft sites that are available, and sometimes often it's because of what makes sense in terms of infrastructure. But other times it doesn't always make sense in terms of infrastructure. So yeah, it's a mixed bag.
But I mean,
And
oh, go ahead. Sorry.
I think home rule is pretty strong.
The political home rule is pretty
Yeah,
strong. I'm talking about
yeah.
as a matter of law. I don't know that there's, you know, looking at 8-2, right, the Zoning Enabling Act, is there anything that precludes the state from being more prescriptive about how zoning should look at the local level, knowing it's going to be implemented at the local level and should be informed by preferences at the local level?
I am not counsel, so I will not answer that question.
All right.
Because I'm not an attorney.
Right. Representative Rojas, I can't find my hand in my phone, so I can't raise my hand. This is Thela. Can I speak?
Yeah, please. Yeah, and then we'll go to Cindy. Yep.
Thank you. I just couldn't find a hand to raise my hand in here. But just a couple of comments. Totally agree on. Actually, I didn't even recognize some of those programs that were in the list, because there are so many, and some of them actually we're not using it, but they're just continue on of what it was funded in the past. I'm so glad that now the resources that we got for our funding is not in buckets to make it for particular area specific need, but it's more overall what those communities need, what we can do with the resources that we have. And talking about the tax credits, which the 9%, we were talking about the 9%, which is the QAP, refers to the QAP because it's competitive. But we have been able to use the 4%, which is not competitive, because we have resources from the state and subsidize that gap. We can fill the gap, and we have done more projects with the 4% than with the 9%, because the 9% funds about 6 or 7 projects a year. We have done 15, 20 projects with the 4% plus blending some of the finance that we have. And then on the small projects, DOH is taking on just to, sometimes we fund the whole project with some subsidy that we get, but we recognize that after, 20 units and less is very difficult as the developers for operations. And there are no capacity in some of the areas, in some of the small towns that we're trying to build, but we're trying to encourage some of the nonprofits also to come in and to provide those services, so that is flexibility, they have the resources, and it's not elaborate. We cannot use tax credit for 20 units because it's too complicated and make it so expensive. So that will bring other resources to the table. So we have been able to do a lot of that this past year, because we have this flexibility, and not everything has to be in a bucket. So it's about diversity of all type of housing. Very low income is a middle income, and is our homeownership, and now to incentivize more supplies. And of course, we have a lot of barriers right now because of supply chain. We have about 500 units that are about to be completed, but switch gears. They can bring the switch gears so that they can bring electricity into the units and finish. So we have all these other challenges that we have in trying to make sure that we have the workforce and we have the capacity, because we are building more than before, but the capacity is not there at all levels, even within our departments, even with the developers and the builders. So I think that keep working the things that we're doing and being flexible Less is more. I tell my legislator less is more, but give us a pot of money, and then we'll be able to adjust and to respond to the needs of each community, especially with those affordable housing plans that we have now, a planner in our staff that is going to be able to continue on and help these towns.
No, thank you, Commissioner. I mean, the only thing I would say is, there are underlying barriers, right, that will exist when we're in this non-inflationary period, or when we're in this non-workforce shortage area, right? So unless we address those underlying barriers, right, the environment will be the same, even when perhaps, God willing, costs come down and we have an abundant workforce to build houses. So that's my concern, right? We can continue to cite those things as barriers today, and they are legitimate. But if we don't change the underlying structure, right, reforming zoning, loosening up things, changing how we fund things, we'll be in the same place 10 years from now.
No, absolutely. I think the zoning is the big issue, right? Is how to make sure that we provide also the infrastructure that it needs to be able to do the zoning. But yes, more support also. I believe that to the small towns, we need to do a lot more technical assistance, a lot more infrastructure resources.
Cindy, been waiting patiently.
I know mine goes back to the demand issue we mentioned earlier. Prior to the pandemic, Connecticut had, and it was in an OPM study, had second to the lowest housing price recovery in the country. So we had a lack of demand here. And I'm in the real estate industry. We were a real estate listing and sales and landlord tenant. We had difficulty getting anyone to move into available properties at the time. That was what we were marketing to. We were saying, give us a Connecticut to sell, because we couldn't sell it. Now it's a flip where we have no unit availability. So back to the chart that was done prior to 2020, I don't know if the lack of things being built was because there wasn't demand. I mean, you have to know that you have someone to move into it. And I know part of the fair share discussion is there are still many communities that no one's making an application to build because they don't believe that they necessarily have people to move into those properties. So I don't know when the demand study was done, if it looked at how many applications went in, if that was a question, or how many were denied, or if it was just how many units were built. So that's, just my comment on that part. The other huge thing that's changed when we look at how we're going to address movement patterns within Connecticut is the fact that a lot of our movement pattern right now is from New York into Connecticut. Because New York City is unaffordable, there also aren't available rents there. People are able to work remotely. We really sold the value. I think people in New York saw the value of Connecticut during the pandemic. And when we build affordable units in Connecticut, I don't think we should assume that we're going to be able to just use those units for people in Connecticut wanting to move, but instead we're going to get a greater distribution of movement from New York City into Connecticut as well. So I think a lot of the goals that we have to look at the demographics and what's happening to movement patterns and who's buying it. Another huge thing right now is I think our national association said something like we're at the highest level of all cash buyers we've had nationwide. So anything that's competing against all cash anything, and same with the comments Francis made about prospective renters that have a lot of cash. I mean, I think a lot of them would pay more if they could. They're competing as people will pay more than what the stated rent is intentionally, just because of demand. So I think there's a lot of factors that are going into the prices in conflict right now.
No, thank you, Cindy. And I still happen to believe that climate change is going to lead to an influx of people coming back from really, really hot places or places that are underwater or can't get insured for a house. And we should be prepared for that as well, too. You heard it here. And maybe I'm not that smart and other people are already thinking about it. I don't know. Other comments or questions? I know we're coming to the end of our time. No, it doesn't look like any. So Tina, Manisha, again, I'm grateful for the work that you did. I know there's probably a lot of questions in the report that are legitimate and can be asked, but again, I think it provides us at least, again, something I already knew to be true. But as I continue to hear people question whether this exists in our state or not, and continue to watch the behavior of policymakers like myself who continue to do nothing on the question or very little on the question of segregation, which is a moral failure of our time, has been for a long time. it was really important for me to see this work and to read it and continue to look at it. And we'll certainly follow up on the recommendations and ensure they're informed by more information than perhaps you were able to put into it, to Francis's point about some of the questions he raised. But I really appreciate everybody's time here today, but especially your work that you put in, and Peter, you as well too. And I know I saw Scott on there somewhere too. I'm sure you had something to do with it as well too. So I appreciate all the time that's gone into this.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, I just want to say thank you as well, Urbanomics. Their contract is complete, but they still wanted to come here and present before all of you and bring some more value to the report. So thank you.
Yeah,
Thank
this
you.
presents us an opportunity to get something done on this. So I appreciate it.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And thank you all for your insights.
All right. I don't know
All
if anybody has any closing comments. Senator Duff, I think, was in transit, so he may or not be able to speak safely. But I'll just.
I'm here. Thanks, Jason. I appreciate it. I'm in transit still, but just want to say thank you to everybody for your good work and good discussion today. Thanks, Jason, for putting it all together. Appreciate it.
All right.
All right.
Well,
Thank
that'll
you.
conclude our meeting for today. Thanks, everybody. Until the next time.